You're going to be speaking at our conference, which is the first Austrian economics conference in Brazil. You're going to be talking about the Austrian business cycle theory, and it's how is it in the perspective of the history of economic thought. How do you see the current crisis in the context of the history of economic thought, especially since we have a great success also of the rap, of the Hayek Keynes rap, and because the Chicago school is now not in a good position after the crisis because they always advocated for centralized money. How do you see the...
Well, first of all, I'm very excited to be here and to be participating in the conference. I think this is big time in terms of intellectual history, and so I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here today. But the main point that the Austrian theory of the business cycle makes is that it's the central bank's fault for causing inflation or higher prices in the economy, and it's the central bank's fault for mismanaging interest rates in terms of producing the boom and the bust, the recession and the boom phase of the cycle, and why all resources can get misallocated into the wrong investments. And so the Austrian theory, which has been downplayed by all the government economists for so long, has finally gotten a hearing through the rap video and through other means, and is starting to be accepted by the general population. It's the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is the problem, and that we need a more market-based money which doesn't have any government control over, which can't be inflated away. You know, our money the value of our money possibly could disappear overnight, and we've seen, you know, other countries where that's happened. You know, in Argentina, in Brazil, and in other places where they can evaporate huge percentages of the money. So the Austrian theory of the business cycle is what explains how the central bank's policies cause inflation and cause this business cycle, and the Austrian theory has helped Austrian economists to be able to predict these major crises. So that, you know, for example, the Austrians were talking about the housing bubble in the United States in 2003. Everybody else was ignoring it or disclaiming it. You know, our central bankers were saying that everything is fine. Even in 2007, all their testimony that I looked at said, you know, everything is great, and even these credit default swaps are making everything liquid and transparent, and they've really helped, you know, improve the market for these loans. Well, 6 months after their testimony, the economy goes into a crisis. They hadn't, well, if they saw it, they didn't tell us about it. But the Austrians were telling, at least the listeners to Mises.org and LouRockwell.com, that the central bank had engineered a bubble in the housing market, and this inevitably has to come undone. It inevitably has to crash. And so that's what the whole theory is about, and Austrians have been able to predict the major crises in the economy over the last 100 years.
Let me ask you about the economics of slavery. I know you're a specialist on the economics of slavery. Tell us a little bit about the cycle of the economics, like how did it start, why did it become economically feasible to have slavery, how did it end as well? And also in the context of today we are not slaves, but since we pay 50% of our income in taxes, we're half slaves, let's say. How do you see that?
Well, slavery got started with public-private partnerships, where the government aligned itself with companies who went to Africa and got all these slaves and brought them to the New World. So it was the power of government backing up the private interest in profit, which is the most dangerous form of social organization, when you have the profit incentive and you have the power of the gun, the power of the warship. And so slavery was started in that way. It was very profitable initially, but inherently slavery is an unprofitable institution. It has to be propped up by government subsidies and government regulations and government restrictions in order to keep it profitable. And so in most of the Western Hemisphere, slavery ended peacefully. It was resolved, in some cases gradually, because it just didn't make any sense. And people saw it as an evil thing, that you shouldn't own other people. You know, and that's a fundamental axiom of Christianity and of all other religions and of most legal institutions. It was just this period of incredible slavery that eventually people realized was not working out economically, was morally reprehensible, and so politicians, as slow and as corrupt and as inept as they are, eventually they figured out a way to, in most cases, solve it. Again, my own country, the United States, is the worst example of this. I mean, in terms of the number of slaves imported and the fact that we had to go through a civil war in which slavery was done away with, and hundreds of thousands of people had to be killed in order to get it done. So I wish that the United States had followed the lead of the South American countries and the Caribbean and so forth, that were able to unwind it in a peaceful manner that was a complete success in almost every respect.
Mm-hmm. And what's the parallel between slavery and the situation we have today, that in which, in effect, we are part slaves or serfs, let's say?
Well, I mean, it's a veil. Today we live under a veil where we don't think of ourselves as slaves. We're independent. We can walk around. We're not chained down. But the plantation still gets its cut. It's still taking 30 to 40% of our production and using it for their income. So, in the slave days, the plantation owner, the slave owner, would work the slaves and feed them just enough to get by, but would capture huge unearned profits. And in today's system, we don't think of ourselves as slaves, but we produce independently, and the government comes in and takes 30, 40, 50% of what we produce. So we are slaves, and we just don't know it. We're slaves, we're tax slaves to the state, and there's no justification that the state gives for taking our money, for stealing our money. Now, they give some of it back to us, and they provide some services, and they try to get us involved with it, and they let us vote, and all these ways to create the veil. But it's a veil of something that is almost as reprehensible as slavery itself.
You said that we are slaves, but we just don't know it. The Indians were hard to become slaves. Do you think this sort of rejection of some other person telling them what to do had part to do with that, because they had a different behavior as the black people, for example, at slavery time?
In terms of Brazil?
In terms of U.S.
United States?
Yes.
They rejected the idea of being willing to accept slavery for a long time. So they interacted peacefully with the white man initially. They traded, and they gave him land, and they moved away from the white people, and they kept moving and moving and moving until it became apparent that it wasn't going to stop. And then the fighting started, and they lost those battles, and ultimately they ended up settling for a system of a sort of a plantation system where they were given plots of land that were of little or no value to the white man. And so they fought it voluntarily by moving away. Then they fought it violently by trying to oppose the white man. And ultimately, they, through sheer use of force, were essentially put onto the reservation. So it was a different approach because the Indian civilization had long traditions, cultural roots, and well-developed societies and systems of belief, whereas the slaves were ripped piecemeal from various different tribes, brought over in non-homogeneous groups. And so there was no alternative for them, whereas the Indians could just move, and they had a system of society to move. The Africans were ripped from various tribes at various times with various languages and cultures and traditions. And so in the early goings, they lacked the cohesion to oppose the system in the same way that the Indians did.
This year at the Forum da Liberdade, a big event in Brazil, the theme of the forum would be Mises and his book, The Six Lessons, as we call in Brazil, the economic policy book. What's your impression of Mises?
Well, I work for the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and I edited a book of quotations by Mises called The Quotable Mises. And I had been reading Mises on and off for various reasons for about 20 years. And then about 5 years ago, they asked me to do this project. And so I sat down with everything that Mises had ever written and just read through them with a highlighter, taking quotes. Well, if we used all of those quotes, the book would have been about that thick. So it was just an unbelievable, fascinating experience to read day after day all of his works. He is the man that has essentially kept liberalism alive, because socialism had just about killed it off, and Mises was the man who kept it alive theoretically and in the academia, and at the Institute we've been able to, or our institutes, we've been able to not only keep that alive, but I think we're on the verge of seeing a massive explosion of interest in the ideas of liberalism and libertarianism that are going to infect the entire world and change the way we live in a very dramatic way.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Absolutely my pleasure.